Let's get the strategic and political details now from NBC News Chief White House correspondent Hallie Jackson. Joel Rubin, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Republican pollster Chris Wilson is with me, and so is Democratic strategist and host of The Hill TV, Jamal Simmons. Hallie, let me start with you. What do we expect to hear from the president?
So listen, Craig, all signals point to the president making a move to get out of the Iranian nuclear deal. That should not be a surprise to anybody who has listened to the president talk about the nuclear deal over the last, 2 years or so. But let me give you a couple of pieces of new information here. Number one, we know now that Congress, or at least House Speaker Paul Ryan, has been briefed on the president's decision. Now, I know your next question is going to be, so what is that decision? And we cannot definitively say just yet, but we do know that the notification process has begun. There is some reporting also from the New York Times, for example, that says the president told French President Emmanuel Macron that he plans to withdraw. We are getting pushback from the White House on that that's not what the president said, but the White House official telling me flatly that is not a correct report. That said, it could still be true that the president does, in fact, is working to tell allies that he is planning to get out. Again, those are what all the signals are from everything that we've seen so far. This is the devil's in the details, right, as always, and the specifics are what are being worked out, or at least what we don't know at this point yet. For example, the sanctions, when they go back into place, if in fact they do end up going back into place, what the time period is there, how long that would last, what the questions are related to any kind of a grace period for a side deal that the president may want to work on with European allies. And then, of course, there's a wild card of international reaction, Craig. You've got concerns, serious concerns from the EU, from other signatories to the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. You've also got the reaction from Iran as well, which I know you'll talk about. This is a pivotal, I don't want to overstate this here, but I do want to pull back, because this is a pivotal moment for Donald Trump's presidency. This is a very consequential foreign policy decision, one of the biggest decisions that he's made in his administration so far. And for the president, he views this as a promise made, promise kept, because this is something, if in fact he does end up pulling out, this is something that he talked about on the campaign trail from the very beginning, Craig.
Hallie, you mentioned our international allies. We know that Angela Merkel lobbied the president directly. We know that in the last few days, Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom also lobbying this president. And you mentioned Emmanuel Macron. If he does decide to withdraw from this deal, what might that mean for our relationship with those allies, if anything?
Well, here's the thing. These allies aren't going to be surprised by this. You heard Macron, when he was here, talk about that publicly. You heard Merkel refer to that, or her government allude to that as well, along with the EU. They know this is where Donald Trump is on this. They understand that President Trump has wanted to do this from the very beginning. So this is not like a big shocker. There have been preparations diplomatically for this moment, Craig. Where does it leave, for example, Europe? Well, depending on the decision, right, depending on the specifics of the decision, kind of on an island with the EU and European allies having to figure out how they then work through some of the nitty-gritty in the either moving forward to the JCPOA, working on a different deal, et cetera. And then, of course, Iran has to decide what it is going to do, whether it continues to abide by the deal, even if it views the U.S. as having pulled out of it or not.
Our Chief White House correspondent, Hallie Jackson, will let you get set up again for this announcement here in roughly 55 minutes. Joel,
thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
The president, he's made no secret of his views on this deal, even before he was president. This is just a small example of some of the things that he said as candidate and president.
The Iran deal made by the previous administration is one of the worst deals I have ever witnessed, and I've witnessed some beauties. You look at this new deal with Iran, it's disgusting. I'm not going to be a John Kerry who makes that horrible Iran deal. Horrible. One of the worst deals. I mean, how do you make a deal like that? This was a deal at the highest level of incompetence. I mean, people know my views on the Iran deal. It was a terrible deal. It should have never, ever been made. We could have made a good deal or a reasonable deal.
Joe Rubin, this is a deal that was negotiated during your tenure at State. Your reaction to the president's assessments, and what do you think that President Trump is likely to do here at the top of the hour?
Well, Craig, it's clear that President Trump has always had a closed mind about the Iran nuclear deal. And if he does pull the United States out, which is expected, it will be the most significant strategic blunder by the United States since the invasion of Iraq. This is real. This is going to put us on a path, inevitably, ultimately, towards conflict with Iran. It will not prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. If he pulls out, there's no plan B. And so what are our options? Our options are very few, if any. And really, this flies in the face of the logic that his intelligence chiefs have said to him, that his Secretary of Defense has said to him, that leading House Republican members are now publicly saying that we need to stay in the diplomatic arrangement with Iran. By pulling out, we're really in uncharted territory.
Joel, you're familiar with some of the criticisms of this deal, the sunset clauses that exist, the fact that the deal itself does not restrict Tehran from testing intercontinental ballistic missiles. What do you say to those that have legitimate gripes with the deal?
Absolutely. Those are correct assessments that the deal did not handle the issues of ballistic missiles or regional activities by Iran or even human rights inside of Iran in that forum. It's true. And that wasn't the point. The point of the negotiation was to prevent the worst weapons, nuclear weapons, from getting in the hands of a regime that no one has confidence in. And we did that. And we don't want to have Iran with nuclear weapons in their hands while engaging in Syria, while engaging in Lebanon. But right now, by pulling out of the deal, that is the risk. It's necessary to engage Iran and other regional partners to deal with these other issues. That should be done, but it shouldn't be done at the expense of the current negotiation and the current deal.
Chris, to be clear, to be fair here, the United Nations has concluded that at no point to its knowledge has Iran violated the terms of the agreement. So why pull out?
Well, to the United Nations knowledge, but we all heard Prime Minister Netanyahu present proof just last week that that was not the case. And the fact is this does allow Iran to continue moving to a nuclear weapon. And in fact, they're allowed to have one as soon as 2023 due to the sunsets that are built into the deal. But I'll tell you one thing. I had the opportunity just a couple weeks ago to go to Israel and stand on the border with southern Lebanon, where a member of the Israeli Armed Forces pointed out to me where the 150,000 missiles were that were paid for by the $100 billion as this deal released and put in the hands of the Iranian mullahs. And frankly, I think that in and of itself shows what a flawed agreement this deal was from the beginning. And I think Howie's right. The president made an agreement. He made a campaign promise, and I expect him to pull out of this deal later today.
Jamal, a majority of the American people believe that the United States should stay with the deal. That's according to a new CNN poll. 63% of folks, when asked, said that the United States should not withdraw from the deal. If you are to believe those numbers, on a domestic level, is this simply another bow to his base?
Well, Craig, it does feel like another bow to his base. It feels like the president is playing politics at the small local U.S. level and not thinking about the geopolitical impact of this. The reality is our children, my new child, all of us are at the whim of this president who is, instead of negotiating peace agreements around the world, seems like he's starting to pull the countries apart from each other. One of the first jobs I had in politics is I worked for a guy named Mickey Cantor who went around the world negotiating trade agreements. And one of the things I learned working and traveling with him is that every agreement builds on itself and you build trust with your partners. The President Trump is pulling that trust away as we're going into something that's very clear, like North Korea, which is another nuclear stance. And if he doesn't have a good deal that he's willing to stand by with Iran, how can we convince North Koreans that we're going to stand by any deal with them?
Who is the president trying to appeal to with the decision on this deal, Chris?
Well, I do think some of it is to his base, but I also believe him. I take him at his word when he says he believes this is a horrible agreement that is one of the most flawed treaties that the United States has ever entered into. As you know, it was not ratified by either House of Congress. In fact, a majority voted against it. So I think coming out of that, the president recognizes that there is a better deal to be made. And the sunset provisions in this are really a fatal flaw. The ability to allow Iran, with full knowledge of the international community, to ultimately be able to develop nuclear weapons, I think just should make this a non-starter from the beginning. And what this does do, him pulling out of it, is I think it will allow him to go back to the negotiating table with a better agreement and one that actually does stop Iran from being able to acquire and build nuclear weapons.
That's a heck of a bet.
Repeat that, Jamal. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
That's a heck of a bet. I mean, we already have an agreement in place, and part of that agreement is in place.
Agreement that gives them nuclear weapons.
Hold on, part of that agreement is in place so that we can watch the Iranians. It's not that we trust the Iranians. The agreement's there, so we have international inspectors there who watch the Iranians.
Not military.
Now we're
going to
snatch that out, and we're going to have some level of trust that this is going to work out in the end.
So, Jamal, what can we
inspect?
Great
negotiator.
What can we inspect? We can't inspect nuclear. We can't inspect military locations.
You correct me if I'm wrong here, but my understanding is that right now we do, in fact, have inspectors on the ground every day in that country. We have cameras inside these facilities. We have other remote detection devices as well. Is that a correct assessment of what the situation is right now on the ground?
That's absolutely right. And these are the most intrusive inspections ever agreed to on in a nuclear agreement. And our inspectors are there exactly because, as Jamal said, we don't trust the Iranians in their behavior. But I have to correct the record here as well. What Prime Minister Netanyahu presented was not new information. What he presented was packaging of information that the international inspectors already knew. And we will be blind in Tehran if we end this nuclear deal. We will not have the ability to go back and say, let's put new inspectors in. How are we going to get them in there? Are we going to invade? Are we going to put inspectors on the ground in a country 3 times the size of Iraq? No, but we have them there now voluntarily, and we need to keep them there. Ending this deal does nothing to prevent Iran from walking away from the inspections regime, and it gives them the high ground.
Chris, and continuing the deal allows them to ultimately acquire nuclear weapons regardless.
No, it does not.
It
That's
does
not
too.
accurate.
The sunset provisions will leave them, but they'll have nuclear centrifuges by 2023.
They have signed on to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They have committed to not ever having a nuclear weapon, and you can renegotiate for additional extensions
because
of
we can
the
trust
deal.
them so much with what they commit to.
Chris,
we have always negotiated additional follow-on nuclear agreements with adversaries. We could do that here as well.
Chris,
you're very optimistic.
Chris, before we get out of here, though, in terms of the message that this does potentially send to North Korea or other allies with which we might have some sort of extended agreement, is the message here that, just because one president likes something or doesn't like something, doesn't really matter 2 years from now, the United States of America, its word really isn't that good and will change anyway?
Craig, it's a fair question. I think what it does, the message is that we have a process in which treaties should be ratified, and it was not followed in this situation. And so for us to go through it, I think if the treaty should be, if we're going to have a treaty, then it should go before the Senate, and the Senate should ultimately have the final authority on ratifying it. That didn't happen, and I think it does show that we need to adhere to the traditional process of what's been the case up until the Obama administration.
Are you proposing a treaty?
Not a treaty necessarily, but I do think we need to reach some level of agreement where, yes, I do think once we pull out, we have to go back and begin the process again. But what exists now ultimately allows them to acquire nuclear weapons, and I think your trust in them is misplaced.
We'll leave it there.
Well, Craig, I think I do think our trust in Donald Trump also is a tough thing to manage because we do know the president does not have a great deal of experience with the truth. So we've got to trust that he's going to be able to negotiate this and finish it. And frankly, he's given us very little to trust in.
We'll leave it there. Jamal Simmons, thank you. Chris Wilson, thank you. Mr. Rubin, thanks as well for your insight today, as always.